If you've just so happened to watch 1,000 episodes of One Piece, you may have heard of a character named Shanks.
One of the 4 Embers of the Sea, and one of the most mysterious men in the One Piece universe. So I have taken an interest to Shanks, to his character, to his cape, to being Shanks as a cosplay.
It's turned into an obsession. In an effort to justify that obsession, I decided to make Shanks' cape. Let's go!
I started by creating a mock-up to create a pattern to use to make the cape. I then gathered my main materials, which included velvet, interlining, lining fabric, and 1/2 inch bias tape. Jumping straight in, I placed my back pattern piece while measuring 5 inches from the side. Then, because I didn't have chalk, I found out that a white color pencil is able to draw on fabric, which made me super glad. I then began tracing the back pattern piece onto the fabric, making sure to leave 1/2 inch at the top to account for seam allowance. And I repeated this for the other side of the back piece. I had a pretty good idea for how I wanted the bottom to look, so using my previous markings, I just connected all of them together to make the shape that I wanted. After that, I just added 1/2 inch of seam allowance all around the perimeter of the piece. And now, here's some fabric cutting ASMR. After cutting out the back piece, I did the same steps to the front piece and the rest of the pieces, honestly. So in total, I got 1 back piece, 2 front pieces, 2 side pieces, and 2 collar pieces. And for your viewing pleasure, there will be an icon in the left-hand corner of this video showing whichever section I am working on in the video. I wanted to add some interlining to the collar piece, so I just cut that out of my interlining fabric. You can feast your eyes on my miserable attempt at pad sewing. It's supposed to be like an invisible stitch, which means like you can't see it from the outside, and you can see how epically I failed at that. After realizing I was utter trash at pad stitching, I ended up cutting off the excess seam allowance because that was only needed if my pad stitching actually worked and actually ended up shaping the collar, which it did not. So, snip snip. I then stitched on bias tape to the collar to act as a case for the boning to sit in. And I specifically sewed the hand casing on because I had seen historical garments with the casing being hand sewn like this, and I thought it was just so pretty, so I wanted to do it myself. So much hand sewing, in fact, that in trade for cutting out many minutes of hand sewing, you guys just have to watch a 10-second ad about my Etsy shop. I have an Etsy shop where I make affordable custom dress forms, so if that sounds interesting to you, please check out the description below. Now, back to the video. Once I completed adding the boning to both sides, I realized I would need another piece of boning in the middle. So I did that. And then I began the complete waste of time, which was trying to finish off the collar by sewing it right sides together and then realizing I cannot flip it out because of the boning. I ended up giving up on it and coming back to it later. You can see I promptly switched over to sewing the back and side pieces together, which went much better. I just ended up sewing a couple inches away from the end of the fabric since I freehanded the bottom and the hems were never going to line up, and I would have to adjust for that later. But yeah, besides that, it was pretty just normal sewing all the way down. Okay, not to toot my own horn, but to totally do. Look at that seam! The front piece needed an interlining layer to be able to shape the lapel, so I cut that out. And I made sure to cut it in the correct direction to make my life easier while pad stitching. Next, I ran a loose running stitch across the two pieces of fabric, and this essentially just makes sure that nothing shifts out of alignment while I am pad stitching. And then I began the laborious task of pad stitching the lapel on. Pad stitching can allow you to shape the garment in a way where it will hold its shape based on the way that you hold it while you're sewing the pad stitching. So you'll see in a second that the lapel actually ends up holding its shape. Looking at the lapel that's holding its shape very nicely. And I decided to do a running stitch here just to keep it flat. Also, I just didn't think it needed as many stitches as the lapel, like the curved part of the lapel. Because on his cape, it's like curved. And if you're like, why does she sound dead in the last clip? It's probably because it was very late at night and I was very sick of hand sewing by that point. Moving on, I still had to secure the interlining piece onto the front piece, and I just chose to do that by tacking it down in a couple places. And once all that's complete, I start cutting off the extra seam allowance on the interlining piece because I just no longer need it, and if anything, it's just going to make any of my seams more bulky. You can see that once I flattened all this down, that this actually wants to lay the way it should, which is essentially just straight up. You need the lining because you see how it holds it up here? Look at this. Man, this really hates me. Okay, anyway, long story short, you need this because it holds it up, otherwise the material just goes floop and lays on the shoulder and doesn't look very nice. Should I have done this before sewing the side pieces? Yes. Do I want to hear a word about it? No. I'm having to do too much hand sewing as it is to listen to anybody say any sort of slander to me at this moment. So, if you couldn't tell by that rant, I was pretty sick of hand sewing, and probably because my rate of hand sewing a single stitch, this is it in real time. Yeah, enough to make a person go crazy, I know. I desperately want to use some hot glue, or just use hemming adhesive and just iron it down. The issue being I don't trust myself with hemming tape, and if I do a hot glue, I will never trust the garment to stay together. So, on to what feels like the 100th hour of hand sewing. All done on both sides. You are currently resting on a dumbbell for me to film this. But it is November 7th, and I have been putting off hand sewing the sides, the interlining pieces to the side pieces. And I really need to get the hand sewing done so I can move on to like the other parts, like machine sewing the front to the back, or working on attaching the canvas to the bottom to make it thicker, or like maybe even start thinking about the lining. So yeah, the hope is I can get all my hand sewing done today on the side pieces and possibly even on the back and the sides to give it more weight. So I went along adding interlining to my side pieces. So once again, I'm back to hand sewing. However, I did get much faster and the results were coming out good. Please tell me you guys see the difference in like the structure and the way this whole seam holds up. Oh, the underlining is gorgeous. Ta-da! Really nice thing about hand sewing is you definitely get faster. Holy. I convinced myself into adding an interlining layer of muslin. So for some context, I had avoided wanting to put in canvas as the backing for like a week because I knew it would result in more hand sewing. However, I was really glad I did it because it made the world of a difference when it came to the end result and how the cake flows. And once I saw it on the back, I knew I needed to add it to the front. So that's me doing that. Guess who figured out what she's gonna do for the lining? So for the back and the sides, I'm gonna use my lining material because I have enough for that. And then for the front lining material, I'm just gonna use the extra black velvet I have. I'm pretty sure I have enough. And so I can combine all the lining pieces together and then sandwich it with the outer pieces. Such a sweet, sweet child with such optimism with how much ease she has to finish the rest of the project. Long story short, sewing the front on is a pain, and then on top of that, the lining fabric, I end up deciding I need to get new lining fabric, so that ends up not working out. But yeah, enjoy watching me struggle for like many, many minutes. So, after that failed attempt, I'm currently once again unpicking this. And I did some research online. I may have not realized how difficult it is to sew velvet because the first time I did it with the back and the sides, it worked out relatively well. I have no idea how I got so lucky twice. But I came across an article that gave a bunch of tips and tricks on like decreasing your tension, like holding onto your fabric more firmly, and changing your foot out for a Teflon foot, and etc, etc. And at the end of that long list, they're like, but you can just use like spray adhesive. I'll have it shown here or something. But yeah, you can just use temporary spray adhesive to make it so that the velvet can't move around. Luckily enough, I have spray adhesive, temporary spray adhesive, due to my small little Etsy shop. So to test if it worked, I took everything outside and sprayed the seam down with spray adhesive and tried sewing it. It worked. Now to just repeat this for the rest of the side and front. So off I went, pinning and gluing the seams together. And this time when I sewed them, all the seams were nice and even. Ta-da! It's something that looks like a cape. So, I don't know if it's easy to tell from the camera, but the hems are all at a different length. I'm gonna start cutting the bottom so that it's all one even height. So I did this mostly just like you would a haircut, by pulling the front two pieces forward and matching them up, and then repeating that length around the rest of the cape. Now, onto the lining fabric. I realized that if I wanted to keep my original lining fabric, that I would have to hand sew all of it onto my cape, and I decided I did not want to do that. So instead, I went to the fabric store and bought some new fabric. And here she is. Everybody say hi to the new lining fabric. Hi! And this is where, if you had the foresight to cut out your lining fabric when you cut out your exterior fabric, you would not have to deal with this. But since I decided to freehand my pattern and sew it before I cut out my lining piece, I'm having to finagle and guess where a lot of it goes. So much futzing around. And let's quickly get our side pieces too. Nice. And it was at this time while editing the video that I really have not explained any of my sewing. So at the beginning, at the curved part of the piece, I just take a lot of extra time and care to make sure that all the seams are aligned on the curves. And for the straight part of the seams, I just generally focus on keeping the two edges straight. Once I've got the seam all pinned, I really don't stress about it too much. I just put it in my machine and try to follow the line. And with any luck, you'll end up with a seam that keeps two pieces of fabric together. Woohoo! A flick of the wrist and a fully made lining piece. So I used my velvet fabric for the front pieces because the lapel portion will be shown. I could have just used velvet just for this portion, but then I didn't buy enough of lining fabric, and it's just we're dealing with it, okay?
So, you know what you're thinking? Man, her floor is dirty.
Well, it's not, okay? It's all paint. It's literally just all dried up paint. Well, with that explanation out of the way, I began pinning the outer piece and the lining piece, starting at the top and making my way across the sides. That is, until I got to the other side and nothing was lining up.
I don't know what's going on because the last edge is not aligning at all. So I have decided to take the decision to flip it inside out and hope it solves all my problems. If that does not work, I don't know what I will be doing, but I can't think of anything else to do, so.
This is me flipping it inside out in the hopes that it fixes all my problems.
See, it does all fine.
Can you see that? Tell me that does not align. It straight up does. And off I went, trying to pin the outer and inner layer together with varying levels of success. I literally probably pinned it and then unpinned it probably 4 to 5 times to get it right. And this is a cape all pinned together. I then took it to the sewing machine to sew the neck portion of the cape together. Rookie mistakes. After fixing that mistake, I took the entire cape outside and sprayed all the seams together. And then it was time to get to sewing. And man, was there a lot of it. This portion of sewing the cape was really scary because I honestly would have no idea if I did it properly until I flipped it inside out. So I sewed incredibly meticulously because of that fear. I sewed the remainder of the top, and then the sides, and then the bottom, making sure to leave a hole to flip the cape right side out. Moment of truth. Time to turn it inside out. And finally, after all that sewing, the moment of truth. It worked! I didn't completely flip the cape inside out, as I knew there were things that I would probably have to tweak, as it wouldn't be perfect on the first try, but I was reasonably happy with what I got. I flipped the cape inside out and made all the adjustments I had wanted to make. Ew. I began finger pressing the seams to make the seams lay crisper and flatter and overall just look way nicer. Just finger pressed all the seams and I popped out the corners properly. Look how good they look. Generally, the seams are looking much sharper, much crisper overall, just even from the finger pressing. So I feel like up on top, I really don't have to worry too much about it. I do think I want to steam here because there's some tension wrinkles that I think I can get out, like right here. Like they're very slight, so I think I can actually just get those out by steaming it. But generally, I feel like the top looks actually pretty nice. But as we move down the cape, you can see that the seam gets much thicker as you go down the cape. Next, I circled up to finishing up the collar, which requires some needle and thread. Here you can see me whip stitch the top of the collar to the bottom, all around the perimeter of the collar. And now we're in the home stretch. So it goes from this to this. Next, we will be using fire to make sure that the edges of our collar do not fray. To finish the collar, I whip stitched the seam allowance down onto the collar. So it goes from this to this. The collar's done, so now onto the cape. Top stitching the bottom of the cape will not only make it look better, but also close the hole that we left in it earlier. With that done, we're now ready to attach the fully made collar and cape pieces together. I carefully align the two pieces, and once they're stitched together, the cape is complete. I finished! This is the cape all done. It looks pretty good. And final reveal coming up next.